Welcome. Welcome. Good afternoon. I know people are still going to be coming in, but I'm going to get going, so I have a couple of announcements to make and try and get us going. So first of all, congratulations to all of you. You've made it through almost the full conference, and give yourself a hand. You know, these conferences often go on the we're going to try and exhaust you principle. And we do throw a lot at you in 2 days. But I find it thrilling. It couldn't happen without our speakers. It couldn't happen without you. And I really do mean that and appreciate you being here. But there's one or two other people that we just should thank at this point as the conference is moving into its last two sessions. Many of you have interacted with Tina Stanton. Yeah. I often tell Tina that, you know, I work for her, and I think it's true. But she is the heart and soul of the center in many ways. She runs a lot of our student programs. She interacts with all of you. And she's just does it all with a smile and incredible efficiency and diligence. I always hear how many people say these are such incredibly well-run and fun conferences to come at, and it's because of Tina. So thank you, Tina, for doing that. And yes, please. And she works with now something almost around 20 student fellows that we now have at the center, who are funded by your memberships and other donations, and they've become an important and thrilling addition to what we do. So I thank you to all the students who are doing that. They've been running around in these shirts. And then I'd also really like to thank Samantha Hill, who is the assistant director of the center right now and has really taken a leading role in the last 2 years, helping to expand and improve and widen the breadth of what we do at the center. So thank you, Samantha. And I just also want to mention Craig Rothstein, who just started here 3 weeks ago, but is the media coordinator, and a lot of you who are in our virtual reading group and Amor Mundi and other events will be interacting more and more with Craig. So thanks, Craig, and welcome aboard. Last few quick announcements. There is an exhibit of Hannah Arendt's memorabilia from her library at the library, which is just over the hill here. If those of you who'd like to go see that, it will be open today until late. After the panels are done today at about 6:15, Samantha Hill is going to lead a group of people who want to go over and walk over to Hannah Arendt's gravesite and pay a tribute to her. And anyone who would like to do that, she'll lead a walk over there. And finally, we still have the raffle open for that drawing of Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher that you can enter out there if you would like. Okay. I want to introduce our following speaker. In a strange way, our following speaker, Chantal Mouffe, is actually somewhat responsible for me being here today. She doesn't know that. I was in my first year of graduate school a long time ago, and I didn't like it. I was in a joint program and did a lot of law school, didn't like that. And I actually thought about dropping out. And I got advice from one of my advisors, which was just take a semester and take courses you want to take. Don't worry about fulfilling your requirements. It's very good advice. And I took a course where we read Chantal Mouffe's work, Hegemony and Socialist Society? What? Strategy. Hegemony and Socialist Strategy that she wrote with Ernest de Laclau. And it was a book that first turned me back onto Hannah Arendt, but turned me back onto a form of politics and thinking and political thinking that has stayed with me ever since and has been a I mean, one of those guiding threads in my work and thinking for the last now 30 years or so. So thank you for that, and it's really an honor for me to be able to introduce and invite Chantal Mouffe to speak to you. She is the professor of political theory at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. Her most recent books include The Democratic Paradox, and the one I mentioned is Hegemony and Socialist Strategy with Ernesto Laclau. She also wrote this little book, which I like quite a bit, called On the Political. And I'm thrilled to welcome her here to Bard. She's going to talk for probably half an hour or so, and then we will be able to have a short conversation. Please welcome Chantal Mouffe.
Good afternoon. I'm too small for this. Thank you very much. Many thanks for the presentation. I'm glad that we've had some impact in your career and interest. It's really, I'm very honored by that. What I'm going to talk to you this afternoon, in fact, is about my most recent book, which has just been published in July in London with Verso. The title is For Left Populism. It's definitively not a book that pretends, to make terrorists. It's a political intervention. It's a book which is very partisan because I feel some urgency. I think that we are today at a crucial moment. I must say that the book is a reflection on the present conjuncture in Western Europe. I insist on that. But as you will see, there are a series of things that absolutely, coincide with the situation in the US. But I always really talk on conjuncture. In a sense, I'm very much inscribing myself in the tradition of Machiavelli, who, as Louis Althusser once wrote, Machiavelli did not speak over the conjuncture, but within the conjuncture. And this is always something that for me is important. So since I live in Western Europe, I think that I wanted to speak from that conjuncture, but I think that many things are also true for the US. So this book, as I was saying, it comes from some sense of urgency I have that we are at a crucial moment because, as one of the theses of the book, is that we are living through what I call a populist moment. Populist moment, which is the result of a series of resistances, of protest movement against the situation which has been created by 30 years of neoliberal hegemony in the West. And I think that the consequences of the 30 years of neoliberal hegemony are that we live today in what is called a post-democratic situation. I'm not going to say just a word about that, post-democratic, what I understand by that. But those resistances can go in many different directions. They can, in fact, lead us to a more authoritarian regime, but they can also lead to what I call a radicalization of democracy. And I'm going to speak about my concept of radical democratic citizenship and the places it plays in my reflection on left populism. But before going to that, I need to say something about the main thesis of the book, For Left Populism. By the way, a little bit publicity. You can buy it if you are interested. It's on sale on the table outside. So, as I was saying, we live in a populist moment because of those resistances against the post-democratic situation. Well, post-democracy, what I understand by that is the following. By the way, I'm not the first one to have put that term. In fact, it's used by Jacques Rancière, but it has been theorized by a British sociologist called Colin Crouch. So it's not, but, and my understanding of post-democracy is not exactly the same as them, but basically it goes in the same direction. The idea that we still, of course, live in societies which call themselves democratic, but basically this democracy does not really represent. I mean, it's like there is a book, it's called Ruling the Void by Peter Meyer, also a British political theorist. And in fact, we could say this is the problem, you know, there's a void, because the two main things which characterize for me a democracy, which are equality and popular sovereignty, have been eliminated. We are, in fact, when we speak of democracy today, basically election, a certain respect of human rights, but everything has got to do with equality and popular sovereignty is considered obsolete. With this post-democratic moment, I distinguish two different aspects. The first one, and that's something that I already discussed in the book that Roger was showing, called On the Political, is what I call the post-political situation. And that, in fact, is already the book was written in 2005, and it was a reflection on the situation in Britain, again, you know, thinking on the conjuncture, basically the third way and the theory developed by Anthony Giddens and put into practice by Tony Blair, that, you know, we were now in societies in which everybody was middle class, there were no more frontier, no more left and right, and that was a wonderful thing, a wonderful progress for democracy. I was already critical of that and saying, no, I mean, democracy, and that's another aspect of my work, necessarily needs to be agonistic in the sense that for citizens to have a say, you know, they need, when they go to vote, to have different projects, different parties offering different view of society. If they don't have that, if basically it doesn't make any difference if you vote for the center-right or center-left because they offer the same thing, then of course you don't have a voice, you don't have a choice. And this is what I call post-politics. So this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, of course, it's a consequence of neoliberal hegemony and basically of the fact that social democratic parties have accepted the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So when they come to power, the only thing that they can do is to manage a little more humanely, with a little bit more redistribution, the situation. But they cannot provide an alternative. This is why the left and right, you know, does not make any difference. We only have what it was called at that time the radical center. You know, the center consensus on the center, what I call that. So there is no agonistic debate. No, and this is for me is really something which is very dangerous for democracy, because democracy requires, for me, the possibility precisely of having a choice between different alternatives. But there is, in this post-democratic situation, new element, and that's an element which is more recent because it's really began to be seen with the crisis of 2008, and it's a phenomenon which I call oligarchization of our societies. The fact that, and of course it's absolutely the case for Western Europe, the situation in the US is a little bit different, not that you are less oligarchical, but I think that you were never as equalitarian as we were in Western Europe. So the difference maybe is not so clear. But basically, today the gap between the popular classes, you know, and the people on the top is much, much bigger. We've, in fact, got a gap between a smaller group of very rich people who are becoming richer and richer and the rest of the population, which is poorer and poorer. For instance, we are clearly seeing a pauperization of the middle classes, a precarization of the middle classes. So our societies, European, are more and more being similar. There was, in fact, a process that I call Latino-Americanization of our societies, you know, seeing more and more like oligarchic societies. So this is what the second aspect, the aspect of equality, which is central for democracy, is also being eliminated. So what I understand by post-democracy is a situation in which, you know, yeah, with democracy, but the main values of democracy don't exist anymore. And what we are saying today, and that is, I will say clearly, since the beginning of, well, I will put the origin of that, the movement of the place, the revolt of Occupy, the Indignados in Spain, for instance. We are seeing a series of protests on the left, progressive protests to that, because in fact, already on the right, we have been seeing resistances against this process, and that, in fact, since the year 2000, we were already seeing protests from the right. But now, in fact, those protests come from both the right and from the left. They are resistance movement, we call them that. And this is why I say we are in a populist moment. And obviously, I mean, what is at stake? But even if it's not perceived by that absolutely, all this is a crisis of neoliberal hegemony. I insist on the hegemony because neoliberal policies are still very much in practice, but since the crisis of 2008, the idea that neoliberalism provided the end of history, the solution to this has been absolutely shattered, and so this is a crisis. But of course, what's going to be the outcome of this crisis? And this is where I think it's really important to see that this crisis, the solution to this crisis, solution, if we can call it like that, can go into a right-wing direction, into a regime that are much more authoritarian, or it can open, in fact, to a radicalization of democracy. And that depends on, that's one of the main theses of the book, so let's say we can say that we are today in front of a struggle between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Let's say articulation of those resistances in a right-wing authoritarian project, or on the other side, articulation into a radicalization project. And this is what I call left populism. So I think it's really important to see that this crisis of neoliberal hegemony I'm not saying it's for next year, but it needs to be, this system is broken. It can't be repaired. So we are going to see a new form of hegemony which is going to be reinstalled. Gramsci will say, well, we are in a situation in which the old is dying and the old is not yet born. I think it's very much, and he called that an interregnum, and this is really very much what we are seeing today. So my argument in the book is that it's very important for the forces of the left, because definitively I say it's a book which is partisan, and I locate myself openly on the left. So it's a call for the people on the left to say, you must understand what is the conjuncture, because you need to act in order to find a way to federate all those resistances into a project which is going to move it towards more equality, more justice. And this is really the task of articulation of a left populism. So what I want to say in the context, of course, of this conference is to show what is the role that my radical democratic conception of citizenship plays in this project of left populism. Because I have been interested, in fact, since even before on the political, I've got a book called The Return of the Political, which already is a reflection on the role of citizenship. And citizenship has always been for me an important theme, because after on the political, I've got another book called Agonistics, where I also insist on the importance of reformulating the conception of citizenship, recovering it, in order to give it a very important activist dimension. Because, well, I don't have time here to enter too much into the theoretical aspect of my approach. This is something which has been developed precisely in the book that has been mentioned, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, written with Ernesto Laclau, where we develop a conception which we call non-essentialist of politics. I'm going to have to say something about that during my presentation, but of course I don't have time to explain exactly all the main elements of this approach. But I think that it's crucial to realize that the whole project of left-wing populism cannot be understood nor can be formulated if it's not according to that approach. And I will say a little bit about that as I go. But basically, the question here is to consider that social agents are always product of construction. It's not essentially mean you've got interests which are given, there, and then politics consists in representing them. We are very much critical of that. We are saying politics is always the result of a discursive construction. Political identities are always constructed through discourses and through form of identification. And the social agent is inscribed in a multiplicity of social relation, which have got all of them what we call a subject position, and in fact, it is articulated around those subject positions. Among those subject positions, one of them is the insertion of the social agent in a political community, and this is its position as a citizen. It is qua citizen that the social agent intervene at the level of the political community. While being a central category of democratic politics, citizenship, of course, can be understood in a variety of ways, and those will command very different conceptions of politics. For instance, liberalism envisages citizenship as a mere legal status and see the citizen as an individual bearer of rights, free from any identification with the we. And of course, it's very important. It's an individualist conception of politics. In the democratic tradition, however, citizenship is conceived as an active involvement in the political community, as acting as part of we, and in accordance to a certain conception of the common good. One of the central theses of my agonistic approach is that citizenship should be envisaged as a political identity which consists in the identification with the what I call ethico-political principle of modern pluralist democracy. And those principles are liberty and equality for all. Those are the principles of legitimacy of modern pluralist democracy. Those principles provide what we could call, following Wittgenstein, a grammar of conduct. This grammar of conduct informs the action of the citizen. And this is, when he acts as a citizen, he's acting in function of the principle of liberty and equality for all. But of course, those principles can be understood in many different ways, so it's acting on the basis of a certain interpretation of those principles. Citizenship, therefore, should not be conceived as a homogeneous identity, because there will always be different and competing interpretation of the value of liberty, equality, and the all to which it should apply. And of course, those values also are embodied in certain type of institution and in certain type of practices. So what I'm saying here, contrary to what people sometimes believe, is if you act as a citizen, you are going to act in a similar way. No, you can act as a citizen in many different ways, according to the way in which his values are interpreted. And this is why my agonistic conception of citizenship envisage citizenship as a contested identity. There are indeed various ways in which one can identify and act as a democratic citizen. For instance, the social democratic conception of citizenship will privilege the struggle for social and economic rights, while a radical democratic conception of citizenship, and this is the one that I advocate, is going to insist on the importance of putting in practice those principles of liberty and equality in many other social relations. Not only, of course, it's not that, social and rights and economic rights are not important, but for instance, everything which has got to do with the new movement equality between the sexes, equality in question of gender identity, racism, this is what a radical democratic conception of citizenship imply. You need to extend the principle of liberty and equality to many more social relations than the one which are traditionally envisaged by social democratic politics. For a left populism, so my more recent book, I argue that a radical democratic conception of citizenship should constitute the locus of the construction of people. Well, here I need to say something because the way I understand populism is in fact on the basis of how the frontier is created. Politics, in my view, always have got to do with the creation of a frontier between a us and a them. But this frontier can be constructed in many different ways. For instance, the Marxist way to construct the frontier is the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. In the populist construction of the frontier is, the people, the underdog against the establishment. And I think that today, this populist conception, given the specific conjuncture, is much more adequate. You can't not anymore organize all the different struggles simply on the basis of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. If you want to articulate the demand of anti-racism, anti-sexism, the environment, extremely important, you need to construct the frontier in a different way. And, but of course, so to create different populism are going to construct the we. By the we, I understand a collective will, and that's what I call the people in different ways. And a radical democratic conception of the citizenship should, in my view, be locus the construction of a we of left populism. And this should be established. Again, it's a concept that we develop in hegemony socialist strategy. We call that a chain of equivalence. In a way in which equivalence is created between a multiplicity of heterogeneous struggle. And the way in which all those different resistances, democratic demands are going to be articulated could be precisely around the idea of citizenship. And a citizenship whose political objective should be the radicalization of democracy. This is what will unite social agents, which in a collective will. Social agent, and I insist on that because it's very important in my conception of citizenship, that those social agents might be engaged in many different enterprises, but their grammar of conduct when they act as citizen is governed by the extension of the principle, ethico-political principle of liberty and equality to a wide range of social relations. So when they act as citizens, this is their objective. Radical democratic citizenship, in fact, plays an important role in my discussion with those, and that's, I don't know if, imagine it's the same here in the US, but among the people on the left in general, there are all those who recognize the importance of all those struggles, but they consider that it is not necessary. In fact, they say it's not even desirable to articulate all those different struggles in a collective will. That's an objection that is often made to the left populist strategy, and they say that, well, to bring together those democratic demands in the creation of a collective will, in the creation of a people, will produce an homogeneous subject that negates plurality. And they conclude that any attempt to articulate the different struggles should be rejected because it will erase the specificity of those struggles and that it is incompatible with democratic pluralism. And in fact, in my book, and this is why radical democratic citizenship plays a very important role, I'm showing that this argument does not work. Because, in fact, this objection that they made to left populism stem from the failure to grasp that the left populist strategy is informed by what I was saying before, an anti-essentialist approach, according to which the people is not an empirical referent, it's not a sociological category, but it is a discursive political construction. It does not exist previously to its performative articulation, and it cannot be apprehended through sociological categories. So it's not a people homogeneous. No, people is created through articulation of different demands. And I think that those critiques reveal lack of understanding of the operation through which a people is constructed. A collective will, but because this is basically what I understand by a people, a collective will, which is created through chain of equivalence, of a multiplicity of struggle, it does not produce an homogeneous subject in which all the differences are somehow reduced to unity. because it is this popular collective will the result of a process of articulation in which an equivalence is established between a multiplicity of heterogeneous demands in a way which maintains the internal differentiation of the group. It is, in fact, because the democratic demands that a left populist strategy seeks to articulate, because they are heterogeneous, that they need to be articulated in a chain of equivalence. Here, for instance, I distinguish myself from the position defended by Hart and Negri with their idea of the multitude, because for the multitude, it's also a multiplicity of resistance, but they necessarily converge. There is a unity which is given already. It is not to be constructed. Well, I think it's not recognizing that there might be many conflicts between all those different demands, and that the unity needs to be constructed. And this is absolutely important, and it is done through the creation of a chain of equivalence. This process of articulation is crucial, because it is by their inscription in a chain of equivalence that singular demands acquire their political signification. It's not so much where do demands come from, which counts, but the way they are articulated with other demands. As the example of right-wing populism testify, for instance, demand for democracy can be articulated in a xenophobic vocabulary. That is, they do not necessarily automatically have a progressive character. It's only by entering in equivalence with other democratic demands, like, for instance, those demands of the immigrants or the feminists, that demand of the working class acquire a radical democratic dimension. And of course, this is true for other demands proceeding, for instance, from women, immigrants, or other discriminated groups. Those demands are not necessarily emancipatory. It's the way they are articulated with other democratic demands that give them this emancipatory dimension. And this is why I think it's very important to ask the question, how is this articulation going to be made? And also to recognize that this demand requires, better in this case, that those demands are articulated around an identification. Here again, the anti-essentialist perspective, and this is something that I draw very much on psychoanalysis. There are no identities. There is every identity is the result of a process of identification. And so we need an identification with an idea of radical democracy. And this is what will make the radical democratic citizen. It is, therefore, with respect to this question of how to envisage the identification with a project of radicalization of democracy, in a way that is congruent with the claim that I've made before, that the chain of equivalence does not produce an homogeneous subject, that I see the notion of radical democratic citizenship as being crucial. If we conceive citizenship as what I say, a grammar of conduct, we understand that it is possible to be part of a people identified around a radical democratic project while being at the same time inscribed in a plurality of other social relations with their specific subjectivities. To act qua citizen at the political level in order to radicalize democracy does not mean discarding other forms of identification, and it is perfectly compatible with being involved in series of democratic struggle of a more punctual nature. For instance, in feminist struggle, in anti-racist, those are different subject positions. Indeed, I would say that a radical democratic citizenship encourages such a plurality of engagement. And a left populist strategy fosters the articulation between what I call the intervention at between the vertical and the horizontal level. Here again, this is a discussion which is very important in the left. There are those who defend the only social movement. They don't want to have anything to do with state institutions, with parties. It's civil society on its own is going to, lead to emancipation. There, of course, the other would say, no, only through to the state institution, through parliament. No, of course, this is not what left populism argues. For a left populism, we need the articulation between what I call the horizontal and the vertical, between involvement in the social movement, but also, working within the institution, trying to reach to power. The left-wing populism definitively want to come to power, want to take the state in order to transform it. And of course, here it indicates that there is a big difference with respect to the way in which the state is understood by many other leftists and the case in which it is understood by left populism. And I come back to a moment about that. But basically here I want to insist that the aim of a left populist strategy is to create what I would call a synergy between the manifold practices where various forms of domination are challenged and those that and all the practices that experiment, for instance, with new egalitarian form of life. We should not oppose that. I mean, it's important to create a synergy between the multiplicity of those practices. To give you an example, for instance, and here I'm going to refer to two movements that I know well, Podemos in Spain and La France Insoumise in France. People who are acting qua citizen in the political project of Podemos or La France Insoumise also intervene in, so acting as citizen, they intervene in diverse representative institutions. This is the aspect of the party, let's call it like that. But they are also engaged in a variety of democratic practices and struggle, focusing on more specific issues. They've got one feet in the state, let's say, and another feet in the social movement. So to partake of of radical democratic citizenship does not preclude participation in a variety of other we, as feminists, as anti-racists. So the radical democratic conception of citizenship that I'm proposing, and here is the last point I want to make, is also very clearly linked with the type of politics that I'm arguing for in the book and what I call radical reformism, or it could also be called revolutionary reformism. What this means is the following. A left populist strategy calls for an engagement with the institution, but in order to profoundly transform the relation of power. But without, and that's absolutely crucial, discarding the key institution of liberal democracy. So it is very different from the pure reformism of the social liberals, traditional social democracy, but also from the strategy of the revolutionary left, because on one side you have a situation which really does not want to transform anything, and on the other one we have transformation, we have a break with the institution of pluralist democracy. The strategy of left populism, in fact, is an institution, is a strategy that wants to engage with the institution to reform them. And it considers that the state is not, as the social liberal belief, neutral, but it's not only pure instrument of oppression. The state is, in fact, is an articulation of different sides that can be transformed, and you can really transform the relation of power by engaging with the states. So contrary to the reformist and also the revolutionary strategy, the state is seen as something which is hegemonically structured, and it constitutes an important side for the counter-hegemonic struggle. So according to the agonistic conception of democracy, there's a multiplicity of sides where one should intervene in order to radicalize democracy, and the state is one of those sides, but of course it's not the only one. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to try to finish quickly to leave some room for discussion. So I want to say the project of radicalization of democracy which is the objective of left populist strategy. That must be clear. And the objective is radicalized democracy. Envisage, therefore, a combination of different forms of democratic participation. It's a conception that does not reject representative democracy. Because I think that today we are definitively in a crisis of representative democracy, but contrary to what some people argue, the situation is not by abandoning representative democracy, by creating some kind of direct democracy, but by really making the representative democracy more representative, because the problem is today, as I was saying, is not agonistic. So you can't have a democracy which offers alternative without being agonistic. If it's not really representative, so we need to make it really agonistic, really representative. And that will imply an articulation of various forms of representation and mode of choosing representative. For instance, I think that direct form of democracy might be suitable in some cases, a variety of participative one in others. But, it's important that there is not one, in fact, what I am critical of is the idea that there is only one form of democracy, direct democracy, for instance, or the idea of the common. No, there are multiplicity of sites and ways in which it is necessary to articulate that. So this is, I think, how we can create the condition for an agonistic confrontation. It is, and this is definitively my last point, and here it might be a bit controversial, I don't know. Well, the rest can also be very controversial, but this last point, and because it's the point where I want to make reference more directly to the question of civil disobedience and Hannah Arendt, is because I defend a radical reformist strategy of engagement with the institution, that I am critical of a certain type of movement of civil disobedience. Those that claim that one should not have anything to do with parties, with trade unions, with traditional political institutions, and that defend a strategy of what called desertion or exodus. This is, for instance, very much the case of the Indignados in Spain. They claim we want real democracy, nothing to do with parties, election, or no. And of course, what happened is that when, after 1 year of real mobilization, they had election, is the Partido Popular, the right, who won with an absolute majority. And we've seen, I'm also very critical of the limitation of Occupy Wall Street, of the Nuit Debout in France, those purely horizontalist movements that, of course, you can say, yeah, they are movements of civil disobedience, but they are movements that do not want to engage with the institution. And I think that, for me, this is something which cannot have any real impact. Because as we have seen precisely with horizontalist movements like the Indignados in Spain and the different Occupy movement, the refusal to engage with political institutions has limited their impact. It is because there was no form of articulation with institutional practices that they soon lost their dynamics. Although, and I want to recognize that such protest movements have certainly played a role in the transformation of political consciousness, it is only when they have been followed by structured political movements, for instance, like in Spain, Podemos, that a political movement ready to engage with political institutions, that significant results have been achieved. So my position with respect to the relation between citizenship and social disobedience is therefore that for what I call practice of civil disobedience to be also citizenship practices. I think, because we should always here to think in practices. So there are certain practices of civil disobedience. Not all, in my views, can be considered as practices of citizenship. To be considered as practices of citizenship, practice of civil disobedience need to engage with the institution of the political community, with the aim of transforming them. And they should not be envisaged as practice of desertion of the political community. And by the way, I mean, this is something which is recognized, openly acknowledged by the people who defend the practice of exodus or desertion. For instance, Paulo Virno, one of the main theorists of the operaista movement, criticized very much the idea of civil disobedience. He said civil disobedience supposes some allegiance with the principle, what I call the ethico-political principle of the community. And he doesn't want that. He wants a total rejection of those principles. You know, so he said the practice that they advocate are not practice of civil disobedience. They are much more radical. They reject the very principle of legitimacy of the democratic system. And my radical democratic conception of citizenship inform practice of civil disobedience, but practice that challenge the dominant hegemony, the dominant neoliberal hegemony, but in the name of a radical understanding of the ethico-political principle of liberty and equality, which constitute the principle of legitimacy of a pluralist liberal democracy. And I think, I mean, we will tell me if I'm wrong, but this, in fact, for me, corresponds to the conception of civil disobedience of Hannah Arendt. So I don't want to establish a difference here. It seems to me that my strategy, of course, he would not have called it like that, but of what I call radical reformism or revolutionary reform, which is in the name of the principle of pluralist democracy to criticize the actual hegemony of neoliberalism. So this is why this left populism is a radicalization of the ethico-political principle of pluralist democracy. It is in the name of those principles that they criticize certain practices. You know? So this is why I think that makes the difference between practice of civil disobedience that will not be made in the name of those principles, that will be in fact a rejection of those principles, and for me they are not, can't be called practices of citizenship. To be called practices of citizenship, they need to be made, you know, in the name of the being too faithful to the very principle of the regime. And, you know, I think that at least this is the way in which I understand civil disobedience in Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chantal. We have just a couple minutes, and I'm going to take some questions. But one question first, maybe just to flesh out what exactly you mean by populism. And I ask that because, I mean, one of the things that your work has been so good at is showing the dangers of a kind of, you call it neoliberal, a post-agonistic or non-agonistic order that doesn't provide a kind of passion to you call for, or you understand the need, I think, for passions in an identification, which you put into a psychological sense in defining the people, the populism. And yet I think a lot of people in this room, and we've already heard people say, well, every inclusion includes an exclusion. There's a lot of people on the left, and not only the left, in the intellectual world, who are afraid of that kind of passionate identification. And I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, one of the lines of Hannah Arendt's I always love is that we all know what we're fighting against, but we never know what we're fighting for anymore. And I'm wondering if there's a passionate identification. Is it, I mean, I assume it's not nationalism or the nation, although I don't know. I'm wondering, where does that passion in the populism come from, or is that, how does that fit into your idea of left populism? Yeah, you should use the microphone. That's right next to you. You're sitting.
Oh dear. Well, there is a whole a chapter in the book about that, because one of the themes in which I've been very interested in my work is precisely the importance of what I call passion in politics. And passion has got to do with the affective dimension. And of course, this is something that I bring from psychoanalysis, but also from Spinoza. For instance, and I made reference to both Spinoza and Freud in my book, because I think that for me, there are two main problems. Well, the main problem with the left is that the left is much too rationalistic. The left believe that they should only give argument. Everything which is mobilization of passion, of emotion, is something that the right does. Well, I think that is totally self-defeating. And in fact, according to me, one of the reasons why today, unfortunately, right-wing populism is got more success than left populism is because right-wing populism will understand much more what politics is about than the left. First, they understand that politics is adversarial, necessarily. You need to have a us and a them. You know, and this is what populism is. You need to establish a frontier. Okay. And that they understand that very well. While, for instance, post-politics precisely is the abandon of this idea. No, we can all, establish consensus. No, politics is, society is divided. I start from a conception of politics which is called dissociative. If there is politics, it's because there is conflict, there is antagonism, and there are antagonism, it's a conflict that cannot have a rational solution. So you need to accept that. You might not like it, but I think that is very often people say, but then if you say that, maybe we could. I say yes, but it's not by negating that you are going. We should not start from how the world should be, but how the world is. And in order from that to see how you can change it, So I think we need to start, the society is divided. I mean, again, that's Machiavelli insisted that there is always in a society umori of il grandi, del populo, and they are in conflict, so this is something which we need to start from there. But of course, that doesn't mean that those emotion, passion are necessarily into a negative authoritarian dimension. I think there is a passion for justice, there's passion for equality. There are passion can be, and again, this is something that we can learn from Freud. Those pulsions are malleable. They can be articulated in different ways, according precisely to the different signifying practices in which they are going to be inscribed. And of course, if, for instance, the only people who are trying to articulate demand, I'll give you a concrete example so that you will understand very well. In France, for instance, for a long time, the working class had been abandoned by the Socialist Party, who believed that, they were so convinced that there was no alternative to neoliberal globalization that they could not have a discourse towards the loser of that. So they started, no. Then, of course, they offered a terrain to Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen went to those and said, yes, I understand your concern, but the problem is the immigrant who are the responsible for their problem. Well, look, it's not surprising that if she was the only one to speak to those people, there is a majority of working class people who vote Marine Le Pen in France, But what is really important with the development of La France Insoumise and Jean-Luc Mélenchon and of a left populism, they also go and speak with those people and try to make them say, it's not your problem. I understand, of course you've got problems, but it's not the immigrants, it's the transnational corporation who are responsible. And in fact, what is really interesting is to see the last election in June last year, in two very important areas where Marine Le Pen was, it was a stronghold of Marine Le Pen. La France Insoumise have won. For instance, in Marseille, which is the place where Jean-Luc Mélenchon was elected, and Amiens, where François Ruffin was elected, they really were elected in area which are strongly Marine Le Pen, because they took the the time, and by the way, many people on the left were criticizing them for going to speak to those people. You know, they say, oh, you should know. No, those people went, and for instance, Macron speak of the leper, la leper, the populist leper. You know, it's like it's some kind of moral disease, and that if people are affected, you should, you know, keep them as far as possible. And no, I think it's totally self-defeating. So one need to engage with those, and one need also to realize that, you know, you need to decide who is your adversary. You need to show, because if you do not offer an adversary, which is an adversary who, for instance, if you say that it's a transnational corporation, of course, they are going to tend to believe this is the immigrant. And also something which is important here is the way in which right-wing populism and left populism construct the people differently. Because, as I insist on that, the people is not an empirical referent. The people is always a political construction. And for instance, the people constructed by Marine Le Pen exclude the immigrants. People is the good French national, you know, those are, the contrary, the people constructed by Jean-Luc Mélenchon includes the immigrant. You see, this is very important, and this is why I'm really convinced that today, and by the way, I think that we could see the same in the US, because the way in which Trump was constructing the people was very different from the way in which Bernie Sanders was constructing the people. You know, so you can see that this is something similar here. And so we can also say in one case it was right-wing populism, in another case left-wing populism. So I think that is really very important. And what is at stake today, if we don't want, you know, all those resistances which are resistances against the situation, like the crisis, to be articulated by a right-wing populist, you need to intervene and to articulate them in a left populist way. This is basically my main message in the book.
Great. Let's just take one or two questions, if we have them, and then we'll let Chantal answer them, and then we'll move to the next panel. So one is back there. Kevin? Is that Kevin? I can't see from here. And one right here in the front row. So we'll take these two questions, and then we'll have to move to the next panel after an answer. You want to stand up and say your name?
Oh, sure. Hi, my name is Kevin. Thank you for your talk. So I have a question about what you see to be the limits of the anti-essentialism that lies behind your account of a left populism. Because I love the argument that the commons around which democratic politics is organized has to be the outcome of democratic politics rather than given in advance. I totally buy that argument, but I wonder for you, are there limits to the kinds of equivalencies we can draw across different...
Excuse me, can you repeat, because I can't really hear what is your... repeat the last part of the question.
So I buy the anti-essentialist dimension to your argument that we should always expect the binding commons of democratic politics to be the outcome of our politics rather than something given in advance. But I wonder if you see limits to the kinds of commons we can construct on the left. So for example, and I'm drawing from my personal experience here, would a union of adjunct instructors be able to draw an equivalence with, say, an adjunct who belongs to a police union? Would that count as a left populism? Are there limits, objective social limits, to the kinds of equivalencies we can draw?
With an adjunct, what's the second adjunct?
There was a member in my union who was both an adjunct instructor and a member of a police union.
Police.
And the adjunct union had to decide, is it acceptable to have in this union of adjuncts
Kevin,
and members who's also a member of
Let me
police
see if I
union?
can help, and you tell me if I get it right, Kevin, all right? So the anti-essentialist idea of creating and constructing a people, I think what Kevin's asking is, once you construct a people, let's say, through an anti-essentialist process like an adjunct union, and then someone comes in and says, I'm a police union, at what point does that, then you have to renegotiate that construction? What are the limits of constructing a we that is always open to being said to be exclusive and thus not inclusive? Is that a...
No, that's exactly right. So there seems to be a tension between the left and the...
Yeah.
openness of the populism.
What?
Is there a way in which the inclusive creation of a we then becomes exclusive, and what are the limits of that?
Well, no, let's say every construction of a we is exclusive, because you can't have a we if you don't have a them. You know, my whole approach is that absolute inclusive consensus is not possible, because, as I say, politics is adversarial, it's partisan. Society is divided. So you always will have the we, them, but they can be constructed in a way which are conducive and to radicalization of democracy, which are compatible with democratic politics and other, and in fact something that to which Roger made reference yesterday in the introductory session, the distinction I made between adversary and enemies. You can construct the them as an enemy to be destroyed. If you construct it like that, of course, you know, you are not in an agonistic situation, because it's impossible to have a community in which the different group in confrontation see the other to be destroyed. It requires to be understood as what I call an adversary. Adversary, and here I can give you, make reference to what I say related to citizenship, you know. And this is why I think that it's important to see citizenship as an identity that is agonistic, in the sense you can have different understanding of citizenship. So, for instance, you are going to have an opponent, you know. Your interpretation of citizenship is different, but you realize that you've got something in common with him, is both of you have got different interpretation of similar principle. You know, so this is what I call a conflictual consensus. In order to have a democratic politics, you need to have people agreeing at least on what are the main values that you need to inform the political community. But you could, and in fact it's important to have the possibility of different interpretation of those values. And this is what I'm saying. For instance, a social democratic conception of citizenship is going to be different from a radical democratic. But what they have in common is that they are, you know, citizens. You treat the other opponent as citizen. It's not the case in a relation of a friend and enemy, you know.
Right. One last question here, Anthony.
Would you say that a rational, coherent definition of populism is impossible, considering, for example, what has happened in Italy recently, where there is a coalition government of two parties, one led by a proto-fascist who favors policies that would benefit the capitalists of the North, and the other one, the Five Star, led by an ignoramus who knows nothing about politics and governance, and who believes that one should give a salary or guarantee a salary to indolent Southerners.
But, I mean, I don't see really what is the question there.
The question
because
is,
you are making a comment on Italian politics, but so what is exactly the question?
The question is a coherent, rational definition of populism possible?
But you can. There are many different ways in which one defines populism. For instance, there are some people who say that populism. No, there is not. Populism is not a concept first. You know, so you cannot try to arrive at defining popular. I consider my understanding is based on a certain definition of what I call populist. I say populism is a strategy of construction of the political frontier. It's an analytical definition. And it said, for instance, and I have in my talk indicated that there are different ways to construct the political frontier. The Marxist one is the frontier between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The populist one is basically is the underdog and those in power. Okay, that's not a rational definition. It's just, you know, an analytical criteria, you know. And I don't think that one can say, what is populism? I don't think it's a question we're asking, because there is not an essence of populism. Populism is a term which is used in many different ways. Today, for instance, it is used particularly in Europe, not so much I feel in the US, because I think in the US I feel more, because the tradition you have in the US of a populist movement that was really a movement that was a democratic movement, so you don't have such an absolutely negative view. In Europe, it's used today as a term of abuse, term populism. And it is used a term of abuse for very clear reason, because the people from the establishment, you know, the consensus at the center, feel threatened by all those resistances towards their hegemony, and they want to disqualify all the people who are criticizing them, you know, to denigrate them, to stigmatize them, populist. So basically what they understand by populism is demagogue. You know, say all those people are demagogue. Well, I think that, and that's what main press is using. I don't think that, you know, it doesn't say anything. It's just an insult. I'm trying to defend an analytical conception of populism that will help us to understand differences between different political movements. But it's not a rational definition, and I'm not pretending to have reached the truth about populism. In fact, that will be completely incompatible with my anti-essentialist approach, you know, because I think that there is nothing that you can, it's always a way of proposing a certain definition. And I think, for instance, the criteria to see if this definition or that criteria is useful is that, does it help us to understand, you know, political phenomenon or not? But it's not a question of truth nor of rationality, which is at stake in here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Chantal Mouffe. I was also thrilled to see you thinking about the relations between Arendtian civil disobedience and your left populism.
Yeah, you did not answer. Can you tell me if that's important for me? Do you agree with what I say, that for Arendt civil disobedience mean?
Very much so, and in fact, it was a question I had but didn't have time to ask. Is very much. It strikes me that your vision is very much comes out of the civil disobedience, or is related to the civil disobedience. You distinguish your thinking from Arendt in some of your writing, yes. Suggesting that she's more interested in a consensus. But I think
antagonism without antagonism.
But in her civil disobedience essay and in other works, I think on revolution especially, there's a strong version of something like a left populism that one can draw out of it. That maybe we'll work on.
So I'm going to present Arendt as a left populism.
Exactly. In any case, thanks again to Chantal Mouffe. I'd like to invite up for the next panel Ann Seaton, Amy Schiller, Kenyon Adams, and Thomas Chatterton. As they're coming to the stage, just a reminder, the raffle winners will be announced after the last panel, so if you want to get in on that raffle for the drawing of Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher by Ken Grimstein, now is your chance. And we're going to start in about 5 minutes, the last panel. Thanks very much.